What's up guys, welcome back to Destiny Updates. In this video, I'm going to finally take an in-depth look at Game Informer's 14-page exclusive article on Destiny, coming from the January issue of the magazine. I should have covered this last month, and I apologize for the delay, but in my defense, I did briefly highlight all of the most important bits in a shorter video right after the magazine was released, so it's not like I completely ignored this. Something to mention before we get into it, there is a few cool images in the article which I cannot show for legal reasons. If you want to check them out, or you want to read the article yourself, you could purchase a digital copy of Game Informer online at the link in the description below, or look for the physical magazine at GameStop. Again, it's the January edition, and this awesome image you're looking at is the cover. Also, I know this is going to be a rather long video with a ton of important info, so once again, I'm gonna put timestamps to different topics in the description below. If you get bored or aren't interested in a specific thing, please check below and use them to jump to something you want to hear about. One final thing before we start, there's a few things in the article I will be skipping over because they were covered in more detail in my previous video, going over the month of Destiny coverage on GameInformer.com. If you missed that video, be sure to check it out, linked in the outro at the end, or in the description below. Anyways, enough of all that, let's get into the breakdown. The article begins with them discussing the core of what Destiny is. Is it a shooter? Is it an MMO? Is it an RPG? Really, we've heard all this before, but Game Informer says they were able to play the game, and their experience goes along with what the various devs have said, which is basically that the core of the game is a shooter, rooted in that Halo style of tight, responsive, action-packed FPS gameplay. Of course, the goal with Destiny is to enhance that by adding many elements from MMOs and RPGs. Moving forward, they discuss a number of locations in Destiny. I know most of us are bored with old Russia by now, but I thought it was worth mentioning that the location is actually based off of the real-world Cosmodrome, located in modern-day Kazakhstan, long since used as the launch site for the Russian space program. I just think it's quite cool when they use a real-world location, but this far into the future. After old Russia, they mention Venus, saying that crackling light flashes through the sulfuric yellow sky. They also say this here was once a scientific research settlement, but the buildings are slowly being swallowed by the Venusian ocean. Another thing they mention is the Vex Citadel, which based on their description, I strongly believe is this odd structure here. They say that its purpose remains unknown, but the Vex unceasingly defend it. Onto Mars, they of course discuss the buried city, saying it was once a thriving metropolis. One cool thing they add though is that it sounds like we'll be able to climb into the upper windows of these big buildings and then make our way down through the buried structures, towards what was once the ground level. They do say that you're likely to find the Cabal blocking your way, which we already know, but they also add that the Vex are at odds with the Cabal, and it won't be unusual to see them in combat with one another. Moving on to the tower, we already know quite a lot about that, but they say you can turn in quest items and interact with fellow players in large open plazas. The tower also houses class-focused areas for Titans, Warlocks, and Hunters to each meet with their fellows. Which I guess is pretty cool. I personally don't see a huge need for it, and I imagine I'd spend much more time in the big open plazas, but I don't know, it might be nice to compare other people of the same class. The final location mentioned is Earth's moon, which doesn't reveal much of interest. After discussing the Hellmouth and caves though, they do say that forgotten treasures hide in the dust on the moon's surface. So that's cool, it's not all deep underground. Now going past that, we're getting into the somewhat more meaty points, with details on our Guardians. Starting out, they once again confirm that the game does allow us to have multiple character slots, as we speculated on from the first vidoc. So we're not confined to one Guardian forever, we'll be able to have some number of Guardians, which is great for replaying and trying out new things. Next, they confirm that we will be able to roam without our helmets on in non-combat social areas. If you watched my E3 trailer analysis and Moon trailer analysis, you'll know I've thought that was the case for some time, but it's nice to have something solid. After that, they mentioned the 3 races, saying, "Humans offer an uncomplicated and familiar experience. They are survivors of the collapse, picking up the pieces of civilization. The Awoken also survived the collapse, but were forever changed. They appear otherworldly and aloof. Finally, the Exo are self-aware machines, built during humanity's golden age. They have been rebooted with no memory of their original purpose, and come across as unyielding and tireless." I thought the descriptions of the Awoken and Exo were both quite interesting. It seems as if the Awoken were originally human, but something happened during the collapse, causing major change. The Exo being ancient self-aware machines is also pretty interesting, although I have to say I had kind of hoped they were ancient humans. You know, cyborgs. I feel like that would have been slightly more interesting, but maybe that's just me. Continuing on, besides the race, we have quite a few more cosmetic options. We can choose our gender, customize our face, hairstyle, and even add tattoos. I was certainly hoping for customizable faces and hair, so I'm happy to hear that. Hopefully there's a lot of options. Moving on to the even more interesting stuff, things that actually affect gameplay, we'll be talking about the role of classes and some interesting details on the leveling up or progression system. First up, Bungie says that with the classes, they're doing something that's a little different from normal RPGs, where each class has a clearly defined role. Continuing that if you want to think of it in MMO terms, all of their classes are damage per second, or DPS classes. Every character is capable of going into a situation and solving it, although they might go about doing it in different ways. Then he says that the class is really more of an emotional archetype. So basically, if you're an MMO player, Destiny isn't going to have the usual tank, healer, DPS setup. You aren't going to have that sort of squad build to get through the mission. Although I'm not too sure when it comes to Destiny's raids, as Bungie keeps saying they're more challenging and require much more strategy, planning, and more players to complete. Moving on with this, probably the biggest news here, they say that your choice of class establishes the style of abilities that follow, but it doesn't determine the abilities themselves. That designation comes from your focus. Each Guardian bears a class-specific focus, and it acts almost like a subclass. Focuses are the primary way you level and improve your character. Each individual focus advances from level 1 to level 20, with new abilities, passive bonuses, grenade types, and more unlocking over that time. Bungie's Tyson Green says that the focus is the thing that carries all your abilities. It allows you to take the Traveler's Light and turn it into effects in the world. The focus defines how you're going to be playing the game right now, much more so than your class. So if you don't quite get it, a focus is an item you equip. Each focus has a different skill tree that you upgrade along over time. As you do so, you'll get new abilities, all specific to that focus you are using. We know your focus affects which abilities you have, which grenade you have, and which passive jump or movement type ability you have. Speaking of which, currently we know of the glide ability, which allows you to hover briefly in the air. Then there's double jump, which is self-explanatory. And finally, the teleport or dash type ability, which jumps you forward a short distance. I'm guessing there will be more of these movement type abilities revealed in the future. And then the last thing that we know is focus specific is your melee attack. Each focus will have a unique one, which is pretty awesome, I think. It also sounds like there will be more focus specific things that we don't yet know of. I think the idea behind the focus is quite cool. Rather than having all of the upgrades directly tied to your character, they are instead tied to an equipable item, meaning that after you've leveled up your focus and you want to try out something new and different, perhaps favoring another style of play, you can simply swap that one in and begin upgrading it. Now, how we acquire these focuses, we don't know. Just have to wait and see. One interesting thing though is that in the E3 gameplay demo, when looking at the player's gear equip screen, we see an item called a pattern. In this case, a basic warlock pattern. There is a very good chance this is something completely different, but I have to wonder if perhaps this was an early iteration of the focus. Seems possible to me, but I could be completely wrong. Anyways, they gave an example of the focus's usefulness. One focus could be built out for your preferred competitive multiplayer loadout, while a second healing-oriented focus could be reserved for cooperative raid work. Then you could swap them out as you please. When spoken of that way, it sounds a lot like a loadout, which I guess it kind of is, but much more in-depth than that since it connects all of your abilities and upgrades. Continuing on with the classes a bit, they basically say that no matter your class, the core experience still goes back to that shooter gameplay. Warlocks may be able to harness the power of the Traveler, but that doesn't stop them from using the big guns either. They also say that each class has one piece of gear unique to them. For Warlocks, their robes set them apart. So if that wasn't clear, the Warlock style of robe is not available on any other class. We'll talk about the other classes' items as we move along. Continuing with the Warlock though, they start with the Circle of Night focus, which they say is a glass cannon with an impressive suite of damage-dealing skills. This focus's super ability is the Nova Bomb, which of course we've seen plenty of times. Then they say that alternatively, you could level up your Heart of Fusion focus, which is support-based and has the Radiance super ability, which we've also seen. This ability revives and buffs your allies. Moving on to the Titans, their class-specific item is the sort of badge of honor that goes down one leg, kind of like a sash or mini cape. I've noticed those before and think it's kinda cool. Continuing on to their focus, which we don't get as much info on unfortunately, this starting focus is centered around close quarters devastation, built to handle the punishment it takes to get next to the enemies and then deploy a Fist of Havoc, which is the ability we've seen used many times by the Titans. It creates that sort of shockwave. Speaking of the shockwave, they say that later upgrades make the shockwave more powerful, adding electrical or damage over time areas that remain in place even after you leave. So basically, it'll continue to harm enemies for some period of time. They were trying to give an example of how upgrades will be within your focus tree. Finally, the Hunter. Obviously, their cloaks are the class-specific item here, and that's probably the coolest one in my opinion. They start with the Gunslinger focus, which they say is perfect for high-value single-target damage. In a pinch, you can pull out your super. The Ghost Gun is a fearsome, mystical weapon that can one-hit kill most opponents. And later on, we can upgrade it with an Immolation perk. Now it sounds like the Ghost Gun is a new name for the Golden Gun we've seen before. All the other abilities mentioned here have been things we've seen in action, so I'm guessing that's the case here as well. Pretty much the last thing they say about focuses is that your focus is synergistic with the gear that's available. You start with your character, take a focus, and then start finding weapons and gear that work best with that focus. Moving on, they mention the 3 weapon types, and how each type, primary, special, and heavy, all have color-coded ammo that can be found on the field. And then they mention the armor types we can change out at will. We have a helmet, arm protection, torso armor, and leg equipment. Each piece has its own bonuses and abilities. So it's very similar to an RPG or MMORPG in that respect. Now, none of that was really news, but I felt it was worth reiterating. Moving on from classes and guardians, now we're going to take a look at some of the new info on the enemy races. They start with the Fallen. Unfortunately, there's really nothing new on them, it's all stuff we knew many months ago. Going on to the Cabal though, there's a bit more. Here's what they say about them. The unstoppable engine of war powers the Cabal, an industrial, militaristic empire that spreads its corruption through organized and efficient expansion and unwavering resolve. So I found that very interesting. They're actually an organized, advanced empire, not a ragtag bunch of divided pirates and scavengers like the Fallen. Anyways, they say that everything about the Cabal is big, heavy, and bulky, from their capital ships to their soldiers. Also, their architecture is dirty and menacing, with smoke coming from vents and oil pouring down the sides. Another thing they say is that when you shoot a Cabal, they squirt dark oil from their armor. Getting to the various classes of Cabal though, we have Legionnaires, which are the basic Cabal we see all the time. Then there's the tougher Centurions, which have jump jets to blast them around. We may have seen some very brief glimpses of them, but not much. After that, we have the Giant Gladiators, which we've seen before, carrying that massive Gatling gun. Finally, the most interesting new one in my opinion are the Scions. These Cabal are smaller than the rest and use their mind in battle to confront enemies and pilot ships. They sound very interesting to me. Going over to the Vex, they say they arrive in our solar system via warp gates, likely from another time in the past or future. And then going forward, they say headshots do little to the Vex, but if you target their abdomen power cores, they explode in a burst of glowing liquid. For the Vex classes, we have Goblins, the common ones we've seen a lot. Then their larger cousins, the Hobgoblins, distinguished by their tails. We don't have any in-game footage of them, but I believe this may be a piece of early concept art. After that are the big, broad-shouldered Minotaurs. We have seen these guys in-game a bit. They look pretty cool in my opinion. But then onto the really interesting classes, there's the Hydras, which they say are segmented machines that float through the air to attack. Each segment bears its own turret, and these robotic centipedes fire those turrets as they wiggle through the air. That description makes a really weird image in my head, so honestly I cannot wait to see them in-game to clear that up. The final Vex class talked of is the Harpy. Harpies fly rapidly in and out of a fight, occasionally pausing to open up their shells to reveal a writhing mass of filaments before they begin firing. So of course, another aerial Vex unit, which sounds pretty badass, and is probably annoying to fight. The last race to look at is of course the Hive, and we've actually seen all of these thanks to the Moon trailer. There's Thralls, the common light unit that rushes you, and then there's Troopers, a bigger unit. After that, there's the cleaver-wielding Knights, and then the floating robed Wizards, which draw on the power of the darkness to fuel their spells, much like we Guardians do for the Traveler, I believe. And then finally the Ogre, the giant beast that can shoot an energy beam from its head. Moving past the enemies, they talk about co-op multiplayer, but don't really reveal anything new. And then they mention that every time you kill an enemy, you get a little bit of XP, which goes towards leveling up every piece of gear you have currently equipped, including your focus. And then they talk about how the game will kind of distract you from your main objective. By that I mean you could be zipping across the map to get to your objective, and then you pass by something along the way, and you get a small objective related to that. Their example was killing a certain number of fallen and Hive enemies you just encountered. And then later they gave another example of a public mission, which was escorting a nearby VIP to safety. I thought that was interesting because it gives us a glimpse at mission variety. Anyways, you could of course just continue on your way to the main mission, but they hope you'll want to check out these other things, explore the world more, and keep coming back. I personally think it sounds quite cool and makes the game's universe seem more alive. Next, they briefly mention Glimmer, which we've known for a while as Destiny's in-game currency. It's this blue shimmering stuff here. It's dropped by enemies, and I'm sure it gets rewarded to you when you complete missions. Anyway, they say that it's a rare energy-based substance, left over from humanity's golden age. So that's interesting. Then they mention another public event, in which they were tackling a high-level fallen captain. I'm sure there are many different types of public events in the game, but as of now we only know of the one from the E3 demo, fighting the Devil Walker, and now this one, fighting a fallen captain. Moving on, they mentioned the whole activities for every mood thing we've heard before, but this time they added that there's a screen-filling game map, littered with icons for story missions, cooperative strikes, competitive matches, and more. It sounds very RPG-ish to me, which is cool. If you don't want to go exploring, or want to place one specific thing, just choose it on the map and your ship will take you there. Next, they talk about a strike on the moon, basically the one in the Moon trailer by the sound of it. Not much new is said, however they do mention that the game has a generous checkpoint system, which popped them right back to the start of the fight after they died. I'm guessing the various game modes in Destiny will implement this differently, but now we know that a checkpoint system does exist for when all of your teammates die. After that, the article switches to competitive multiplayer. They say that in the fiction of Destiny, Guardians fight against each other in support of the various factions. The factions we know of are New Monarchy, Dead Orbit, Future War Cult, Seven Seraphs, and Osiris. So as suspected, these 5 factions are at odds with each other. They essentially employ the player to fight for them. We've also seen some examples of faction-specific weapons, and the ability to customize your gear with faction logos. But another thing that we learned is that these competitive battles occur in contested locations around the solar system, which is pretty cool as it leads to more variety in maps, and hopefully game modes. And then something interesting that the competitive design lead Lars Bakken said is that the factions helped and were integral to forming the city. He also said that they are very interested in pushing Guardians out into the universe and helping them to re-establish and take back those places. So I thought that was pretty interesting. While they're obviously fighting over control and whatnot, they are also a major driving factor in bringing humanity back to what it once was. I am very interested in learning more about the factions, what their goals and agendas are, and how the whole thing works. After the mention of factions, they talk about a couple of Destiny's competitive game modes. The first one is basically a ground control mode. Groups of fire teams fight for control of 3 points. The interesting bit though is that you don't just get points for capturing the locations, but rather each one you hold gives you a score multiplier for kills, assists, and whatever else. I think that's quite cool. Then the other mode they mentioned is a smaller deathmatch style mode, but with another interesting layer. Points are awarded for kills, as you'd expect, but you also get points for reviving fallen teammates before they respawn. If the points rewarded for reviving is the same as getting a kill, I think that would make for a very interesting match. I expect to see a wide range of interesting modes, with many more to come out over time. In another interview, they said the playlist system for Destiny's competitive is very robust, much like Halo's, and in some cases even more customizable. Moving on, they mentioned that Guardians in competitive start the match without any heavy ammo. It is occasionally dropped in, and that's what influences movement around the map. We've heard this before, but it seems worth reiterating as it's quite important. Basically, since you go into competitive with your complete loadout that you own and customize, they can't drop heavy weapons onto the map like in Halo. Instead, they get essentially the same result by giving you ammo for the weapon you already own. Also, when you kill someone who had heavy ammo, that ammo drops and you can grab it, just like a weapon would. I personally think that sounds like a great system, as it allows for the progression system where we build our own character, but it also means people won't spawn in with uber weapons ready to go. The match will stay interesting with people moving around to get ammo. But continuing on, they say that maps have a lot of verticality, with lots of high ledges and such. And maps have shifting environmental features, like giant mechanisms that move to alter lines of sight, or even using the glare from a distant sun to approach enemies unawares. I'm a big fan of dynamic elements in multiplayer maps, so I think that sounds awesome. Moving forward, there's a segment on weapons and gear. Much of it is old news, but something they mention is how they're putting a bigger focus on gear having special abilities or boosts, as opposed to numerical values. Their example is that you'd be more inclined to switch helmets if the new one has some potent ability, rather than if it just had a slightly better rating. That same example should go for just about all your gear by the sound of it. And then they mention how every item has its own short upgrade tree. And the item not only gets better, but also acquires new abilities the more you use it, which we've seen some examples of with the Thunderlord. Then they mention the 4 gear types, with their color codes. There is Basic, which is white, Common, which is green, Superior, which is purple, and finally the coveted Exotics, which are labeled gold. They also say that you can only have 1 exotic weapon and 1 piece of exotic gear equipped at any given time, but you can have more in your inventory and then switch them out as you please. Then finally they gave an example of what an exotic armor piece may do, which is that a helmet could dramatically reduce all headshot damage. After that, they show a little bio of 3 exotic weapons, which are Red Death, Closing Time, and Yellowhorn. We've seen these plenty before, but there's some very interesting new info about them here, basically showing some of the major perks you can unlock for exotic weapons. First, Red Death, the exotic pulse rifle. They say this weapon has a bunch of perks that are especially prevalent in competitive multiplayer. The one example they give is the ability to regenerate health at an increased rate. And then for Closing Time, the exotic sniper rifle, it can camouflage your entire body when you are zoomed in with its scope, which is a pretty major benefit. And then it has another perk where if you shoot an ammo pickup from a concealed location, the ordnance goes straight into your bags. That does confuse me a bit though, we've not heard any mention of these ammo pickups before, as far as I know. It'll be interesting to see how that works. Anyway, onto the final weapon, Yellowhorn, exotic rocket launcher. Its big perk is after you launch a rocket, secondary sentries deploy at the site of the impact to devastate foes that pass by, which sounds awesome. Going on to the final section of the article, they once again say that Destiny features a cinematic story with a clear conclusion, but Bungie hopes to keep us invested long past the story's completion. And then they talk about the game having a lot of mid-level and especially endgame content, challenging raids and other activities that'll switch to higher level play. And of course, that's not including competitive multiplayer, which is going to be huge, I'm sure. Overall, Destiny is going to keep us occupied for a very long time. And then of course there'll be DLC and content updates to fill the void between titles. Chris Butcher even says right here that they definitely plan on making sure that the world is updated and kept alive over time. At the very end, Game Informer says, Destiny's sheer breadth and depth stands out as one of the most daring experiments in modern game development. Drawing from conventions established in a handful of other genres, Bungie is shaping an experience that plays unlike anything else. Your anticipation and excitement is justified. Start planning your journey into the unknown. Considering that the Game Informer guys actually got to play Destiny, I think that's really awesome to hear and definitely gets me even more excited for the game.
As guardians, we will stand together, seize our destiny, and become legend.
Anyway, that's absolutely everything I could glean from the 14-page article. Once again, this is from the January edition of Game Informer magazine. Please consider leaving this video a like if you enjoyed or found it helpful. These long breakdowns do take a lot of time and work, and likes help show me that you appreciate the effort and enjoy the content. If this could pass 1,000, that'd be awesome and I'd really appreciate it. Also, please let me know in the comments what you thought about everything here, and what you think of the focuses. I'm excited to hear your opinion on that. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I really do appreciate all the support. Once again, I'm really sorry for the delay in getting this video out to you guys. There was a lot of other news I was covering in December, and then I got a bit sidetracked over the holidays, so I apologize for that. But that's it for this update. Thank you so much once again, and I'll see you in the next one.